Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturette about covariation and variable binding. We've seen pronouns before, and in this lecturette what we'll do is look at how pronouns can be interpreted as bound variables and trigger covariant readings where the referent varies along with some quantifier. So if you look at a sentence like one, say Alyssa blamed herself, then that's a straightforward reflexive kind of meaning. And what that sentence means is that Alyssa blamed Alyssa because herself is a pronoun, the pronoun would refer, and so forth. But we can often interpret pronouns as a bound variable. So if you look at 2, every player blamed herself. What we don't want this to mean is that every player blamed every player. Remember that quantifiers don't refer, so the assignment index doesn't, the assignment won't actually map an index to every player. It's not an entity. So what is this pronoun going to mean? Well, if it has an index, we can't replace it with every player like we can with Alyssa. So if you look at 3, right, Alyssa blamed herself means Alyssa blamed Alyssa. But every player blamed herself does not mean that every player blamed every player. And this works with a number of phenomena, not just with reflexives. It works with embedding with pro. So if you say Alyssa wants to quit, then pro can be interpreted as a pronoun. We say Alyssa wants Alyssa to quit. But we can't really say that with every, right? And this is one of the facts that actually led to using pro instead of some kind of transformation. So we say every player wants to quit. That does not mean that every player wants every player to quit. Right? Every player wants themselves to quit. So we can use the non-reflexives as well. So we've seen reflexive, we've seen pro. We can see it in ordinary pronouns as well. So if you look at 5, Alyssa saw the snake next to her. Right? We can replace her with Alyssa. But if we say every player saw the snake next to her, then we can replace that with Alyssa, or we can have the same kind of reading where every player saw the snake next to her, not next to someone else. And so we say that this is a bound variable reading because it seems like it's interpreted as a variable that is not, a variable that's not interpreted with respect to the syntax, but with respect to every player. So if you look at 7, right, we can think of it this way. Every player X blamed X. Every player X wants X to quit. Every player X saw snake next to X, and so forth. We can do this over and over again. And so essentially then, the referent of the pronoun is determined by this quantifier. And as the member of the domain in that quantifier changes, as it varies, the referent of the pronoun varies. So they vary together, we say they covary. And we say that this reading is a covariant reading or a bound variable reading. And if you look at 16, every player blamed herself. At number 10. If every player blamed herself, we can go down the list, right? Alyssa blamed Alyssa, Melissa blamed Melissa, Kaylee blamed Kaylee, and so forth. So much for truth conditions. That works out pretty well, and it's pretty intuitive. So, how does this interpretation work? How do we get this bound variable reading? How do we get covariance? Well, if we look at a sentence like 2, every player blamed herself, we can build an LF and start from there, right? So we build this LF in 11, every player blamed herself. It's pretty straightforward. But now let's assume that herself is G of 2. And we build that sentence together, and what we end up with is every player blamed G of 2. But if G of 2 is Alyssa, then this sentence means that every player blamed Alyssa, which is not what we want it to mean. We want every player to blame every player. We want Alyssa to blame Alyssa, and Kaylee to blame Kaylee, and so forth. We don't want everyone blaming Alyssa. So how do we get that? How do we get the object essentially to match the subject? So let's go back to the sentence, right? How do we get a bound variable reading? Well, we bind the variable. But if we bind the variable, we need a binder. We have a mechanism for that. We use the binder index, but our LF didn't have one. So we have to put one in. Well, we can't just throw in an index willy-nilly. Right? How does the index come about? Well, it comes about through movement. So we can QR every player. It leaves a trace. That trace will fill the argument slot of blame. And then the binder will bind that variable. But so long as the variable has the same index as the pronoun, then when we bind one, we'll bind the other. We bind them together. And this is where the covariation comes in. So if you look at 13, we get the LF like this, where we have moved every player. So we can see the LF in 13. What we've done is we've taken every player, we've left a trace, and then we will bind it. We'll just move it as far as we need to, and then we bind this trace. And as long as these share an index, then they will be co-bound, and they will create a property together. So now we just use predicate abstraction. This will be interpreted as G of 2, and we get the structure in 14. Now we get blamed G of 2 of G of 2, and that's a sentence. We can bind that, get predicate abstraction. That gives us lambda y, blamed y, y. So now we have the property of blaming yourself. Then we plug that into our quantifier, and then we get the right result. Every player has the property of blaming themselves. So we get a nice and simple result. This gets us the right truth conditions. It gets us the covariation, and allows us to understand how these processes work without really having to do a lot of extra or novel stuff. Right? We don't have to introduce anything new. We just have to accept that a quantifier can move, and we already accept that, right? The quantifiers move at LF in order to make this work. So now that we have that, we can look at a kind of ambiguity that arises from the fact that pronouns that aren't reflexive don't have to be bound. So we have a sentence like this one, every player wore her uniform. Well, this is ambiguous between what's called an anaphoric reading, where this is an anaphoric pronoun. So this is interpreted with respect to an assignment. And we have a covariant reading, where this pronoun is interpreted with respect to an operator. That is to say, it is a bound variable. Something like this. So how do we make that work? Well, it's going to be the same process. So the first example, every player wore her uniform, with the anaphoric pronoun, we'll simply plug in the property wore her uniform into every player. Whereas if we have the covariant reading, then we get a binder. And we see the difference in LFs in example 18. So the two work together, and you can work out the meanings. They work out pretty straightforwardly. All right, so there you have it. That's covariation in a nutshell. We have a variable, and we bind it. And once we've bound it, then if it's got the same index as another pronoun in the sentence, then that pronoun gets bound too. And so the two start varying together. And then we plug that into a quantifier, and we get our quantificational reading. So that works out pretty simply, and we'll be able to use variable binding for a lot of interesting phenomena now, and understand ambiguities like this pronoun ambiguity that's pretty common around the world.